An aging black mechanic was quietly repairing an old car in his small garage when a young man, thin and soaked in snow, stepped inside. His trembling voice begged for a job to help pay for his mother's cancer treatment. The young man's devotion touched the mechanic's heart, so without hesitation he hired him, taught him everything he knew, and even withdrew every dollar he had saved over a lifetime so the boy's mother could begin treatment. He never knew that years later the young man would return successful and determined to repay him with the same kindness that had once saved his life. Before we continue, tell us what time it is and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hype because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The snow fell steadily against the corrugated metal roof of Theodore Teddy Barnes's auto repair shop, creating a soft whisper that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At 68 years old, Teddy had been turning wrenches for nearly 5 decades, his weathered hands telling the story of countless engines rebuilt, transmissions repaired, and dreams kept alive one vehicle at a time. The shop on Elm Street wasn't much to look at, a converted garage with oil-stained concrete floors and walls lined with decades-old calendars and faded photographs of classic cars, but to the working-class families of Cedar Grove it was a lifeline. Teddy's prices were fair, his work was honest, and he never turned anyone away, even when their wallets were lighter than their problems were heavy. This Tuesday morning in mid-December started like any other. Teddy arrived before dawn, brewing his first pot of coffee in the ancient percolator that had been his companion since the late 80s. The familiar sounds of the awakening neighborhood filtered through the walls, school buses rumbling past, dogs barking their morning greetings, and the distant whistle of the early morning freight train that carried timber from the mills up north. Teddy was bent over the engine of Mrs. Helen Kowalski's old Honda Civic, a car that had seen better days but still carried her faithfully to her job at the diner, when he heard the hesitant footsteps outside. Through the frost-covered window he glimpsed a slight figure pacing back and forth in the falling snow, gathering courage for something. The knock, when it finally came, was barely audible above the gentle sound of falling snow. "Come on in," Teddy called, wiping his hands on a red shop rag that had seen more oil changes than he could count. Doors open. The young white man who stepped inside was 18, maybe 19, with sandy brown hair dusted with fresh snow and clothes that had seen too many washings. His sneakers left wet prints on the concrete floor, melting snow pooling around his feet as he stood there shivering. What struck Teddy most, though, were the boy's eyes, blue as a summer sky but clouded with worry far too heavy for someone so young. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Mr. Barnes?" "That's me," Teddy replied, studying the young man's face, "though most folks just call me Teddy. What can I do for you, son?" The boy, he looked more like a child standing there, dwarfed by the cavernous shop, shifted nervously from foot to foot. "My name's Luke Hastings. I live over on Pine Street with my mom. I heard you sometimes help folks out when they're in trouble." Teddy had heard that story before, more times than he cared to count. It usually involved a car that wouldn't start, a repair bill that might as well have been a mortgage payment, and a family caught between pride and desperation. He'd learned long ago to listen first, judge never. "Depends on what kind of trouble we're talking about," Teddy said gently, pulling up a worn wooden stool. "Why don't you sit a spell and tell me what's on your mind?" Luke remained standing, his hands clasped so tightly in front of him that his knuckles had gone white. "It's not about a car, Mr. Teddy. It's about my mom. She's really sick." The words tumbled out then, as if a dam had finally burst. Luke's mother, Catherine, had been fighting breast cancer for 2 years. The treatments had drained their savings, forced them to sell everything they owned of value, and still the bills kept coming. She'd been getting better, the doctors had said, but last month the cancer had returned with a vengeance. "She needs this new treatment," Luke continued, his voice growing thicker with each word. "The insurance won't cover it because they call it experimental, but the doctor says it's her only chance. It costs $15,000 and we don't have anything left." Teddy listened in silence, his calloused hands folded in his lap. He'd lived long enough to know that life had a way of kicking folks when they were already down, but that didn't make it any easier to witness. In the boy's desperate voice, he heard echoes of his own past, a young man facing mountains too tall to climb alone. "What about other family?" Teddy asked quietly. "Anybody else who could help?" Luke shook his head. It's just been me and Mom since I was 12. My dad, he left when she first got diagnosed. Said he couldn't handle it. The bitterness in those last words could have etched glass. So what is it you're asking me, son? Luke took a shuddering breath. I'll work for you. I'll do anything. Sweep floors, organize parts, whatever you need. I'm a fast learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I just need to borrow the money for Mom's treatment, and I swear I'll pay you back every penny, even if it takes me the rest of my life. Teddy studied the young man's face, the desperate hope warring with the fear of rejection, the pride that made asking for help feel like swallowing glass. He saw something else there too, something that reminded him of himself at that age, a fierce determination to protect the people he loved, no matter the cost. You got any experience working on cars? Teddy asked. Some, Luke replied eagerly. I've been fixing our old Corolla for the past 3 years, ever since Mom couldn't afford to take it to shops anymore. I learned from YouTube videos mostly, and I bought a repair manual from the used bookstore. I know I'm not a real mechanic, but I'm willing to learn. Teddy nodded slowly. In his 5 decades of working on cars, he'd learned to spot natural talent. More important, he'd learned to recognize character. This boy had both. Tell you what, Teddy said, standing up from his stool. Why don't you show me what you can do? Mrs. Kowalski's Civic here needs new brake pads. You think you can handle that? Luke's eyes widened. You mean right now? No time like the present. Tools are over there on the pegboard. Let me see what you're made of. For the next 2 hours, Teddy watched as Luke worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom failure wasn't an option. The boy's hands weren't as steady as they would be with experience, and he had to stop several times to think through the process, but his instincts were solid. More importantly, he treated every component with respect, understanding that someone's life might depend on his work. Not bad, Teddy said when Luke had finished. Little rough around the edges, but you've got the right idea. Brakes look good and solid. Luke beamed with pride, the first genuine smile Teddy had seen from him. Does this mean? It means you've got yourself a job, Teddy replied. As for the other thing, well, that's going to take some thinking. $15,000 is a considerable sum. The hope in Luke's eyes dimmed slightly, but he nodded. I understand, Mr. Teddy. Just having the job means the world to me. When can I start? How about right now? I've got a transmission that needs rebuilding, and these old hands could use some young eyes to help spot the problems. As they worked together through the afternoon, Teddy found himself remembering another young man from decades past, himself at 25, standing in a bank manager's office, hat in hand, asking for a loan to start his own shop. The answer had been no, delivered with the kind of polite dismissal that left no room for argument. It had taken him 3 more years of working for other people before he'd saved enough to strike out on his own. But Teddy had been lucky. He'd had time on his side, and his dreams weren't a matter of life and death. This boy didn't have that luxury. That evening, long after Luke had walked home through the snow, Teddy sat in his small office at the back of the shop, staring at a bank statement and doing arithmetic on the back of an envelope. $15,000. It was more than he'd ever loaned to anyone, more than his emergency fund, more than he could afford to lose. But as he watched the snow continue to fall outside his window, Teddy found himself thinking about second chances and the people who had given them to him along the way. His mind wandered back more than 40 years, to a day not unlike this one. More than 4 decades earlier, Teddy was 24 then, fresh out of the army, and full of dreams that seemed as solid as morning mist. He'd learned mechanics in the service, working on everything from jeeps to helicopters, and he'd come home to Cedar Grove in the early 80s with a plan: save enough money to open his own shop, marry his sweetheart Violet, and build a life worth living. The reality had been harder than the dream. Jobs were scarce in those days, especially for a young black man in a town where some folks still remembered when the diner had separate entrances. Teddy had found work at Anderson's Automotive, a larger shop on the other side of town, but the pay was barely enough to cover rent on his tiny apartment, much less save for the future. He'd been working there 6 months when old man Anderson called him into the office on a gray February morning. "Teddy," Anderson had said, not looking up from his paperwork, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go." The words hit like a physical blow. "Sir, did I do something wrong?" Anderson finally looked up, his weathered face showing something that might have been regret. "You're a good worker, Teddy, maybe the best I've had. but some of my regular customers, they're not comfortable having you work on their cars. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's just business." Teddy had understood, all right. He'd understood that talent didn't matter when prejudice held the scales. He'd walked out of Anderson's shop that day carrying his tools and wondering if his dreams were just elaborate self-deception. But fate had a different plan. 3 blocks from Anderson's shop, Teddy's old Buick had chosen that exact moment to break down. Steam poured from under the hood like a white flag of surrender, and Teddy found himself coasting into the parking lot of a small garage he'd never noticed before. The sign above the door read O'Sullivan's Auto Repair in faded blue letters, and through the open bay doors, Teddy could see an elderly white man bent over the engine of a pickup truck. "Excuse me," Teddy had called out, "my car just overheated. I don't suppose you could take a look." The man straightened up slowly, his hand pressed to his lower back. Declan O'Sullivan was 68 years old, with silver hair and eyes the color of faded denim. He'd been running the shop for 30 years, and he'd seen every kind of car trouble imaginable. "Pop the hood," O'Sullivan had said simply. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Teddy had expected the same polite dismissal he'd grown accustomed to, but O'Sullivan had surprised him. After a brief examination, the older man had diagnosed the problem, a blown radiator hose, and quoted a fair price for the repair. "Only thing is," O'Sullivan had added, "I'm booked solid for the next week." Unless he'd paused, studying Teddy with sharp eyes. "You seem to know your way around an engine. You wouldn't happen to be looking for work, would you?" That question had changed everything. Declan O'Sullivan had been born in County Cork, Ireland, and had come to America as a young man with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief in the dignity of honest work. He'd faced his own share of prejudice in the early years, when signs in shop windows read "No Irish Need Apply." Perhaps that shared experience had given him the ability to see past the color of Teddy's skin to the skill in his hands. For 3 years, Teddy had worked alongside O'Sullivan, learning not just the technical aspects of auto repair but the business side as well, how to deal with suppliers, how to estimate jobs fairly, how to build relationships with customers based on trust rather than the lowest bid. O'Sullivan had been more than a boss, he'd been a mentor, a father figure, and eventually a friend. When the older man's arthritis had finally forced him to retire, he'd made Teddy an offer that had seemed too good to be true. "This place could be yours," O'Sullivan had said one evening as they'd locked up the shop together. "I know you don't have the money to buy it outright, but we could work something out, maybe a partnership at first, then you could buy me out over time." Teddy had been overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, but practical concerns had forced him to decline. He was planning to marry Violet that summer, and they'd been talking about starting a family. Taking on the debt and responsibility of the shop had seemed too risky. Instead, Teddy had taken a job at the Ford dealership across town, steady work with good benefits and a regular paycheck. It had been the sensible choice, the safe choice, but as he'd watched O'Sullivan close the shop for the final time, Teddy had felt something precious slip away. The dealership job had lasted 15 years. Teddy had been good at it, eventually working his way up to shop foreman, but he'd never forgotten the dream of owning his own place. By the time he'd finally saved enough money to make that dream a reality, he'd been in his early 40s, and the fire in his belly had dimmed to barely glowing embers. Still, he'd done it. He'd found the old garage on Elm Street and turned it into Teddy's Auto Repair. It wasn't the grand enterprise he'd once envisioned, but it was his, and that had been enough. Now sitting in that same shop more than 4 decades later, Teddy found himself thinking about Declan O'Sullivan and the gift the old Irishman had tried to give him. O'Sullivan had seen something in a young black mechanic that others had missed, and he'd been willing to take a risk on that potential. Maybe it was time to pay that gift forward. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of December day that transformed Cedar Grove into a winter wonderland. Fresh snow blanketed everything, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood and creating a peaceful silence that felt almost sacred. Teddy arrived at the shop earlier than usual, his boots crunching through the pristine snow, his mind made up but his stomach churning with the magnitude of what he was about to do. He'd spent most of the night thinking about Luke Hastings, about Declan O'Sullivan, about the thin line between wisdom and cowardice that he'd been walking for too many years. At his age, playing it safe had become second nature, but safety had a cost. Sometimes the biggest risk was not taking one at all. Luke arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, just as Teddy was finishing his second cup of coffee. The boy looked better than he had the day before. His clothes were still worn but clean, and there was a determined set to his shoulders that spoke of decisions made and accepted. "Morning, Mr. Teddy," Luke said, hanging his jacket on a hook by the door. "What do you want me to start with today?" Teddy set down his coffee mug and studied the young man's face. In the morning light, Luke looked even younger than his 18 years, but there was something ancient in his eyes, the weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for his age. "Before we get started," Teddy said, "I want to talk to you about that other matter we discussed yesterday." Luke's posture stiffened slightly, as if bracing for disappointment. "Yes, sir. I've been thinking about it all night, and I've made a decision." Teddy paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm going to loan you the money for your mother's treatment." The words hit Luke like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face cycling through disbelief, hope and something approaching panic. "Mr. Teddy, I can't ask you to do that. It's too much money, and you barely know me." "You didn't ask," Teddy replied calmly. "I'm offering, but there are conditions." Luke nodded eagerly, tears starting to form in his eyes. "Anything, I'll do anything. First, you work here full-time, until you graduate high school. I'll work around your class schedule, but when you're not in school, you're here learning the trade. Second, after graduation, you work here for 2 more years at full salary while we pay down the loan. And third," Teddy paused, his voice growing softer, "you promise me you'll use this chance to build something better for yourself and your mother." "I promise," Luke whispered, the words barely audible. "I swear to God, Mr. Teddy, I'll make you proud." Teddy nodded and walked to his desk, pulling out a checkbook that had seen better days. As he wrote, his hands were steady, but his heart was racing. $15,000. It represented years of careful saving, of choosing the generic brand at the grocery store, and driving his old truck an extra year rather than replacing it. But as he tore the check from the book and handed it to Luke, Teddy felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of being able to change someone's life with a simple gesture. Luke stared at the check, as if it were written in a foreign language. "Mr. Teddy, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Teddy replied. "Wait until your mother gets better, then we'll talk." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Luke threw himself into his work with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. He arrived early, stayed late, and absorbed knowledge with the hunger of the truly motivated. Teddy found himself marveling at the boy's natural aptitude. Within a month, Luke could diagnose common problems, almost as quickly as Teddy himself. More importantly, the customers took to him. Luke's youth and obvious enthusiasm were infectious, and his genuine desire to help people translated into a level of customer service that had regulars specifically requesting him for their repairs. Catherine Hastings' treatment began on a Monday in mid-December, with the first infusion scheduled just 10 days before Christmas. Teddy had driven Luke to the hospital that first day, partly to offer support, and partly out of curiosity to meet the woman who had raised such a remarkable young man. Catherine Hastings was 43 years old, but cancer had aged her beyond her years. Her once blonde hair had grown back in patchy wisps after her previous round of chemotherapy, and her skin had the translucent quality of fine china. But her eyes, the same startling blue as her son's, blazed with a fierce determination that reminded Teddy why Luke fought so hard for her. "You must be Teddy," she said, extending a hand that felt fragile as a bird's wing. "Luke's told me so much about you. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." "No thanks necessary," Teddy replied. "Your boy's earned every penny of it. You should be proud of him." Catherine's smile was radiant despite her obvious exhaustion. "I am. He's the best thing I ever did with my life." The experimental treatment was aggressive, designed to attack the cancer with maximum force before the holiday break. Catherine spent 5 days in the hospital for the initial round, emerging weak but hopeful. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. The cancer was responding better than expected to the new protocol. As Christmas approached, Teddy found himself thinking about Luke and Catherine more than usual. The boy had mentioned that they'd never had much money for celebrations, that most Christmases had been quiet affairs with homemade gifts and simple meals. With Catherine's illness, this year would likely be even more subdued. The idea came to him on a cold evening 3 days before Christmas, as he was closing up the shop and watching the snow fall outside. He called Luke, who was still at the hospital with his mother. "How's she doing?" Teddy asked. "Better," Luke replied, and Teddy could hear the hope in his voice. The doctors say she can come home tomorrow. She'll be weak for a while, but they're really pleased with how she's responding. That's wonderful news, son. Listen, I was wondering, what are you two doing for Christmas? There was a pause on the other end. Probably just staying home. Mom's not up for much, and honestly we're just grateful she's alive. I understand that, but here's what I'm thinking. I make a pretty decent turkey, and it seems a shame to cook one just for myself. Why don't you both come over to my place for Christmas dinner? Nothing fancy, just good food and good company. Another pause, longer this time. When Luke spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Mr. Teddy, you've already done so much for us. We can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. And truth be told, I could use the company. My wife Violet passed away 20 years ago, back when I was still a younger man, and my son Jerome died in Afghanistan the same year. The holidays can get pretty lonely when you're on your own. Then we'd love to come, Luke said quietly. Thank you for everything. Christmas Day arrived with fresh snow and temperatures cold enough to make the world feel clean and new. Teddy had spent the previous day preparing, roasting a turkey that was probably too large for 3 people, baking sweet potato casserole from his late wife's recipe, and making a pecan pie that Violet had always loved. His small apartment above the shop had never felt particularly homey. It was more of a place to sleep than a place to live, but Teddy found himself actually decorating for the first time in years. He put up a small artificial tree he'd found in storage, hung some lights around the window, and set the table with dishes that had been gathering dust since Violet's death. Luke and Catherine arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Luke supporting his mother as she carefully navigated the stairs. Catherine had dressed for the occasion in a blue sweater that matched her eyes, and she'd put on makeup to hide some of the pallor that lingered from her treatment. She looked fragile but determined, carrying a tin of homemade cookies that she'd managed to bake despite her weakness. I know you said not to bring anything, Catherine said as Teddy helped her to a comfortable chair, but I couldn't show up empty-handed after all you've done for us. The apartment was warm, and filled with the rich aroma of roasting turkey and baking pie. Teddy had put on some old Christmas records, Nat King Cole and Bing Crosby, and the music created a gentle backdrop to their conversation. They ate dinner slowly, savoring both the food and the company. Teddy told stories about his years working on cars, about the strange things people tried to fix with duct tape and hope, about the customer who had accidentally filled his diesel truck with regular gasoline. Luke shared tales from his first weeks at the shop, laughing about his mistakes and the patient way Teddy had corrected them. But it was Catherine who brought the deepest joy to the gathering. Despite her weakness, she had a warmth and humor that filled the room. She told stories about Luke's childhood, his first attempt at fixing a bicycle, the time he'd tried to cook dinner for her birthday, and nearly set the kitchen on fire, the way he'd always been protective of her, even when he was small. He's been my guardian angel since the day he was born, Catherine said, reaching over to squeeze her son's hand. Even when he was little, he was always trying to take care of me. When his father left, Luke was only 12, and he told me, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll look after you," and he has, every single day. Luke's ears turned red, but he didn't pull his hand away. "You've done the same for me." As the afternoon wore on, they moved from the dinner table to the living area, where Teddy had set up the small Christmas tree. He'd bought a few simple gifts, a set of precision screwdrivers for Luke, and for Catherine, a soft blanket in a shade of blue he thought she'd like. Catherine's eyes filled with tears when she unwrapped the blanket. "Teddy, this is too much. You've already given us everything." "It's just a blanket," Teddy said gruffly, uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. "Thought you might need something soft while you're recovering." Luke gave Teddy a watch, not an expensive one, but a practical timepiece with a second hand that could be used for timing engine performance. "I noticed your old watch was broken," Luke explained. "Figured you could use a new one." For Teddy, who had spent the past 5 Christmases alone, the gifts were less important than the simple fact of sharing the day with people who cared about him. As the winter sun set early, and the apartment grew darker, illuminated only by the lights on the tree and the warm glow of the space heater, Teddy felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Catherine had fallen asleep in the armchair, the new blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a peaceful expression on her face. Luke sat on the floor near the tree, helping Teddy organize the new screwdrivers into their case. "This is the best Christmas we've had in years," Luke said quietly, glancing over at his mother. "Maybe the best Christmas we've ever had." "It's been pretty special for me too," Teddy admitted. "Having you both here, it reminds me of what the holidays are supposed to be about." "Family," Luke said. "Family," Teddy agreed. Even though they weren't related by blood, some bonds he'd learned ran deeper than genetics. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights on the tree blink in their steady rhythm. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the world in another layer of white. "Mr. Teddy," Luke said eventually, "I just want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes me, I'm never going to forget what you did for us. You saved my mom's life, and you gave me a future. That's not something I can ever repay." "Then don't try to repay it," Teddy replied. "Just promise me you'll do the same for someone else someday, when you get the chance. That's how this works, we pass it forward." Luke nodded solemnly. "I promise." They woke Catherine gently when it was time for them to leave, and Teddy helped Luke get her down the stairs and into their old Corolla. As he watched them drive away through the softly falling snow, their taillights disappearing around the corner, Teddy felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the dinner he'd eaten or the heat from the apartment above. He'd helped save a life, given a young man a chance, and spent Christmas with people who felt like family. At 68 years old, after a lifetime of work and loss and loneliness, Theodore Barnes felt like he'd finally understood what it meant to live a meaningful life. The snow continued to fall as he climbed back up the stairs to his apartment, covering the tracks in the parking lot, and making everything clean and new again. It was, Teddy thought, the perfect ending to a perfect day. He had no way of knowing that in less than a month, everything would change. 4 weeks later, the call came on a Thursday evening in mid-January, just as Teddy was closing up the shop. Luke's voice on the phone was hollow, mechanical, drained of all the joy that had characterized it for the past several weeks. "Mr. Teddy, it's back. The cancer, it's back." Teddy's heart sank. He'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes the cruelest defeats came disguised as victories, but that knowledge didn't make the blow any easier to absorb. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "Bad," Luke's voice cracked. "Worse than before. It's in her liver now, and her lungs. The doctor says." He couldn't finish the sentence. Teddy closed his eyes, feeling the weight of mortality settle over him like a familiar coat. "I'll be right over." He found Luke and Catherine sitting in their small living room, surrounded by medical pamphlets and insurance forms that painted a picture more devastating than any diagnosis. Catherine looked smaller than when Teddy had last seen her, as if the cancer were physically diminishing her even as they spoke. But her eyes still held that fierce spark, and her voice was steady when she spoke. "Teddy, I want you to know how much these past weeks have meant to us. Having Luke working for you, having hope, it's been a gift I never expected to receive." "Don't talk like that," Teddy said firmly. "We're going to fight this thing." Catherine smiled sadly. "No, we're not. Not this time. The doctors have been very clear about that. This cancer is different, more aggressive, more widespread. The treatments that worked before won't work now. There have to be other options. Clinical trials, different doctors, there are," Catherine said quietly, "but they cost money we don't have, and even then the chances are slim. I won't bankrupt my son chasing miracles." Teddy looked at Luke, who sat staring at his hands as if they held answers to impossible questions. The transformation in the young man was heartbreaking. All the confidence and hope that had been building over the past weeks had evaporated, leaving behind a lost boy, facing a future too terrible to contemplate. "What if Teddy began, but Catherine cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "You've done enough, more than enough. You gave us precious time together, and I'll be grateful for that until my last breath." The next 3 months were a lesson in grace under pressure. Catherine faced her declining health with a dignity that humbled everyone who knew her, using her remaining strength to prepare Luke for a world without her. She helped him apply for colleges, taught him to manage the household finances, and filled notebook after notebook with advice, memories and expressions of love for him to read after she was gone. Luke continued working at the shop, clinging to routine as an anchor in the storm. His work didn't suffer. If anything, he threw himself into it with even greater intensity, but the light had gone out of his eyes. Teddy watched the young man retreating into himself and felt helpless to stop it. Catherine Hastings died on a cold morning in early April, with Luke holding her hand and Teddy keeping vigil from a chair in the corner of the hospital room. Her last words were to her son, "Be brave, baby, be brave and be kind, and make your life count." The funeral was small but heartfelt. Catherine had been a private person, but the people who knew her understood that they had lost someone special. Teddy delivered one of the eulogies, speaking about the courage it took to raise a child alone, and the legacy that lived on in the young man Catherine had shaped. Luke stood at the graveside like a statue, accepting condolences with mechanical politeness, while his soul seemed to have retreated to someplace Teddy couldn't reach. In the weeks that followed, he continued showing up for work, continued doing excellent repairs, continued going through the motions of living. But the passionate, curious young man who had burst into Teddy's life months earlier had been replaced by a ghost. Teddy tried everything he could think of to break through Luke's grief. He assigned him more challenging projects, hoping that problem-solving would rekindle his interest. He shared stories from his own life, hoping that perspective might help. He even arranged for Luke to shadow a master mechanic at a specialty shop in the city, thinking that new experiences might jar him out of his depression. Nothing worked. Luke performed every task competently, but without enthusiasm or joy. He was fulfilling his obligations to Teddy, but it was clear that his heart was no longer in it. The breaking point came on a cold morning in late February, just over a year after Luke had first walked into the shop. Teddy was working under the hood of a delivery truck when he realized that Luke, who was supposed to be rebuilding a transmission at the next bay, hadn't made a sound in over an hour. He found the young man sitting on a crate, staring blankly at the disassembled transmission parts spread out before him. "Luke?" The young man looked up, and Teddy was shocked by what he saw in those blue eyes. Not just grief, but a kind of existential emptiness that spoke of someone who had lost not just his mother, but his sense of purpose. "I can't do this anymore, Mr. Teddy. The transmission. It's a tough one, but you've got the skills." "No," Luke interrupted. All of this, I can't pretend that any of it matters anymore." Teddy felt his heart constrict. He'd seen this kind of despair before, in the eyes of soldiers who had seen too much, in the faces of people who had reached the end of their ability to hope. It was dangerous, and it was contagious. "Son, I know you're hurting. You don't know," Luke said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You don't know what it's like to watch the only person who ever loved you die by inches while you stand there helpless. You don't know what it's like to realize that everything you worked for, everything you hoped for, was just an elaborate way of postponing the inevitable." Teddy sat down on another crate, facing Luke across the scattered transmission parts. For a moment, he considered sharing his own losses: his wife Violet, who had died of a stroke 5 years earlier, his son Jerome, who had been killed in Afghanistan, his own battles with despair and meaninglessness. But he realized that this moment wasn't about his pain. It was about finding a way to reach a young man who was drowning in his own. "You're right," Teddy said finally. "I don't know exactly what you're going through. But I do know something about loss, and I know something about the choice you're facing right now." Luke looked up, something flickering in his eyes for the first time in months. "You can let this break you," Teddy continued. "You can decide that because your mother is gone, nothing else matters. You can quit the shop, quit school, quit trying, and maybe the pain will be easier to bear. That's one choice. What's the other choice? You can decide to honor her memory by becoming the man she believed you could be. You can take all the love she gave you, and all the lessons she taught you, and use them to build something meaningful. You can choose to believe that her life mattered, and that yours does too." Luke was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning a gear from the transmission. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not strong enough? Then you lean on the people who care about you until you are." Teddy replied, "You think your mother raised a quitter?" For the first time in months, Luke almost smiled. "No sir, she definitely did not." "Then don't you dare prove her wrong." The road back wasn't straight or smooth, but it was forward. Luke threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, not just performing tasks but truly learning the craft. Teddy watched him develop from a competent technician into someone who understood that auto repair was about more than fixing machines. It was about keeping people's lives moving. As Luke's high school graduation approached, Teddy found himself facing a dilemma he hadn't anticipated. The young man's skills had grown to the point where he could easily find work at any of the larger shops in town, probably for better pay than Teddy could offer. More importantly, Luke had been accepted to the technical college in the state capital, where he could earn a degree in automotive engineering. Teddy knew that keeping Luke at the small shop on Elm Street would be an act of selfishness. The boy had potential that deserved a bigger stage, opportunities that a small-town garage couldn't provide. But the prospect of losing his apprentice and the son figure he'd become left Teddy feeling emptier than he cared to admit. The conversation happened on Luke's last day of high school, as they were closing up the shop together. "Mr. Teddy," Luke said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had been rehearsing difficult words. "I need to talk to you about something." Teddy's stomach clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "What's on your mind, son?" "I've been thinking about the college program. The one in the capital. It's a good program," Teddy said carefully. "You'd learn things there that I could never teach you." Luke nodded, looking down at his hands. "I know, and I know you probably think I should go. What do you think?" "I think." Luke paused, struggling with the words. "I think my mom would want me to get the best education I can. She always talked about me going to college, making something of myself. She would be proud of what you've already made of yourself," Teddy said quietly. "But she'd want more. She'd want me to reach as high as I could." Teddy felt his heart breaking even as he recognized the rightness of Luke's reasoning. "The college program starts in the fall." "Yes, sir. Classes begin in September. That gives us the summer to train a replacement," Teddy said, proud that his voice didn't betray the sadness he felt. "And to make sure you're ready for whatever comes next." Luke looked up sharply. "You're not angry?" "Angry," Teddy laughed, though it came out a little hollow. "Son, I'm proud of the man you've become, and excited about the man you're going to be. Your mother raised you right, she taught you to reach for better things." "I'll pay you back," Luke said earnestly. "Every penny of that loan, plus interest. It might take a while, but I swear I'll do it." "I know you will," Teddy replied. That was never in question. The summer passed too quickly. Teddy found himself trying to pack years' worth of wisdom into their remaining time together, sharing not just technical knowledge, but life lessons learned through 5 decades of working with his hands and dealing with people. Luke absorbed it all with the hungry intensity that had characterized him from the beginning. But Teddy could see his mind already reaching toward the future, toward possibilities that a small garage in Cedar Grove couldn't contain. The day came, as such days always do, with a mixture of pride and sorrow that left Teddy feeling hollowed out despite his genuine happiness for Luke's opportunities. They stood outside the shop in the early morning light of a crisp September day, Luke's old Corolla packed with everything he owned. "I'll call," Luke promised. "I'll write letters, and I'll come back for visits." "You better," Teddy replied, pulling the young man into a fierce hug. "And Luke, don't you ever forget where you came from, or the people who believed in you." "Never," Luke whispered. "I promise." Teddy watched the old Corolla disappear around the corner, carrying Luke toward a future bright with possibility. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of the loneliness that settled over him like a familiar coat. The shop felt emptier after Luke left, not just physically but spiritually. Teddy continued his work, continued serving his customers with the same care and attention he'd always provided, but the joy had gone out of it. He found himself thinking about retirement, about selling the shop and moving to Florida like so many of his contemporaries had done. But something held him back, a sense that his story wasn't finished yet, that there were still chapters to be written. Luke's letters came regularly at first, full of excitement about his classes, his professors, and the advanced diagnostic equipment he was learning to use. Teddy treasured each one, reading them multiple times and filing them carefully in a folder that grew thick with updates on Luke's progress. As the months passed, the letters became less frequent, then sporadic. Teddy understood. The boy was building a new life, forming new relationships, discovering aspects of himself that had been dormant during the years of crisis. It was natural and healthy, but it still stung. 11 years went by. Luke graduated from the technical college with honors and immediately landed a job at a prestigious automotive engineering firm in Detroit. His letters spoke of designing next-generation electric vehicle systems, of working with the brightest minds in the industry, of opportunities that seemed to multiply with each passing month. Teddy felt proud and heartbroken in equal measure. He'd helped launch Luke toward a future beyond anything the young man could have imagined when he'd first walked into the shop, but that success felt like a door closing on their relationship. The monthly payments arrived like clockwork, Luke had insisted on setting up automatic transfers to pay back the loan, often sending more than the agreed-upon amount. Teddy deposited the checks dutifully, but they felt impersonal, transactional, like receipts for a kindness that had been reduced to numbers on a bank statement. 15 years passed. Luke's letters became Christmas cards, then stopped altogether. Teddy heard about him occasionally through the small-town grapevine, promotions, awards, rumors of important projects. But Luke Hastings had become a success story from Cedar Grove's past, not part of its present. Teddy convinced himself that this was how it should be. He'd given Luke the foundation to build a meaningful life, and the young man had done exactly that. The fact that this life didn't include regular contact with an old mechanic in a small town was the natural order of things. But late at night, when the shop was quiet, and the only sounds were the settling of old wood and the distant whistle of freight trains, Teddy sometimes wondered if he'd been forgotten entirely. 15 years after Luke left, Theodore Barnes was 83 years old when the diagnosis came, delivered by Dr. Ramirez, with the gentle directness of someone who had broken such news too many times before. The words aggressive and inoperable seemed to echo in the sterile examination room, but Teddy found himself oddly calm as he absorbed their meaning. "How long?" he asked simply. 6 months, maybe 8 with treatment. "I'm sorry, Teddy." Teddy nodded, already thinking about the practical matters that would need attention. The shop would have to be sold or closed. His few remaining possessions would need to be distributed. There were no children to notify. Jerome had died in Afghanistan 20 years ago, and Violet had been gone for 20 years as well. The loneliness he'd carried for so long suddenly felt like preparation for this final journey. He chose to forgo the aggressive treatments that would buy him a few extra months at the cost of whatever quality of life remained. Instead, he focused on putting his affairs in order with the same methodical care he'd brought to rebuilding engines. The hardest part was deciding what to do about the shop. Teddy's auto repair had been his life's work, the place where he'd found purpose and built relationships that had sustained him through decades of joy and sorrow. The building itself wasn't worth much. The land was more valuable than the aging structure that housed it, but the idea of seeing it bulldozed for a strip mall or fast food restaurant felt like a betrayal of everything he'd built. He was sitting in his office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, sorting through files and wrestling with these decisions, when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the concrete floor. Teddy looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Kowalski with her eternally troublesome Civic, and felt his heart stop. Luke Hastings stood in the doorway, 33 years old now, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the fact that he'd put on weight around his middle. His sandy hair was shorter, professionally styled, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and high-stress decisions. But those eyes, still the same startling blue, were exactly as Teddy remembered them. "Hello, Mr. Teddy." Teddy stared for a long moment, wondering if his illness was causing hallucinations. "Luke, what are you doing here?" "I heard about your diagnosis," Luke said quietly. "I came as soon as I could." "Heard from who?" Teddy's voice was sharper than he'd intended, colored by years of wondering why this young man he'd loved like a son had vanished from his life. Luke had the grace to look ashamed. "Dr. Ramirez is my cousin." "He thought I should know." "Your cousin?" Teddy shook his head slowly. 15 years, Luke. 15 years without so much as a phone call, and you show up because your cousin thought you should know I'm dying." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Luke's composure cracked, and Teddy could see the boy he'd once known in the man's stricken expression. "I know," Luke whispered. "I know how it looks, and I know I don't have any right to be here. But I needed to see you. I needed to what? Ease your conscience. Check off one last obligation before the old man dies." Teddy's anger surprised him with its intensity. He'd thought he'd made peace with Luke's absence, convinced himself that it was natural and expected. But seeing the young man he'd once thought of as a son standing there in his expensive clothes, successful and distant, brought all the hurt rushing back. Luke took a step forward, his hands held out in a gesture of supplication. "It's not like that, Mr. Teddy. I think about you every day, every single day." Funny way of showing it. "I know, God, I know how this must look to you." Luke's voice broke slightly. "But you have to understand, I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that I wasn't good enough. Afraid that the success I was having was just luck, and that if I came back here, you'd see right through me. Afraid that I'd disappoint you the way I disappointed myself. Luke paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. The guilt had been suffocating at first. Every promotion felt like a betrayal, every success a reminder that I'd abandoned the man who saved me. So I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that an occasional check in the mail was enough. It wasn't until Dr. Ramirez's call that I realized I'd been running from my own shame, not protecting you from disappointment. Teddy studied the younger man's face, seeing past the success and sophistication to the insecurity that still lived beneath. Disappoint me how? Luke laughed bitterly. Look at me, Mr. Teddy, look at what I've become. I work for a corporation that cares more about quarterly profits than building cars that last. I design planned obsolescence into vehicles because that's what the market demands. I make more money in a month than you probably made in a year, and for what? So rich people can feel good about driving electric cars that cost more than most people make in a decade. That doesn't sound like disappointment to me, Teddy said carefully. That sounds like success. It's not the kind of success my mother would have been proud of. It's not the kind of work you taught me to value. Teddy felt his anger beginning to ebb, replaced by understanding. Sit down, son. Luke moved to the familiar wooden stool where he'd spent so many hours 15 years ago, but his adult frame made it seem comically small. I've thought about calling you 1,000 times. I've written letters I never sent. I've driven to the city limits twice, then turned around because I couldn't face the possibility that you'd look at me and see a stranger. But you're here now, Teddy observed. Because I can't let you die thinking I forgot about you. Because I can't live with myself if I don't tell you what you meant to me, what you still mean to me. Teddy leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of mortality and memory pressing down on him. Tell me about your life, Luke. The real story, not the resume version. For the next 2 hours, Luke talked. He spoke about the early years in Detroit, when homesickness and imposter syndrome had nearly driven him to quit and come back to Cedar Grove. He described the gradual seduction of corporate success, the way each promotion and raise had felt like validation while slowly pulling him away from the values Teddy had taught him. He talked about his attempts at relationships, all of which had foundered on his inability to open up about his past or his feelings. He spoke about therapy sessions where he tried to unpack his guilt over his mother's death and his fear of letting down the man who had saved them both. Most painfully, he described the growing realization that professional success had not brought him the satisfaction he'd expected, that designing cutting-edge vehicles for wealthy clients felt hollow compared to the simple joy he'd once found in keeping Mrs. Kowalski's old Civic running. I became everything I thought I was supposed to become, Luke concluded. But I lost track of who I actually wanted to be. Teddy listened without judgment, recognizing in Luke's story echoes of his own young adulthood, when the pressure to succeed had sometimes threatened to overshadow the simple satisfaction of doing good work for honest people. You know what I think, Teddy said when Luke finished. I think you're being too hard on yourself. You took the opportunities that were offered to you just like your mother would have wanted. The fact that success didn't bring you happiness doesn't make you a failure, it makes you human. But I abandoned everything you taught me, did you? Teddy interrupted, or did you just forget it for a while? Because the young man sitting here right now, wrestling with questions about meaning and purpose, sounds exactly like the boy I used to know. Luke looked up sharply. You think so? I know so. The question is, what are you going to do about it? That conversation marked the beginning of what Teddy would later think of as the sweetest months of his life. Luke took extended leave from his job, something his accumulated vacation time and executive status made possible, and essentially moved back to Cedar Grove to spend time with Teddy. It wasn't a complete return to the past. Luke rented a small apartment above the hardware store rather than moving back to his childhood home, and he maintained his responsibilities in Detroit through phone calls and video conferences. But for the first time in 15 years, he was a regular presence in Teddy's life. They worked together in the shop, with Luke's sophisticated knowledge of modern automotive systems complementing Teddy's deep understanding of mechanical fundamentals. Teddy found himself learning from his former apprentice, while Luke rediscovered the simple satisfaction of solving problems with his hands. More importantly, they talked. Long conversations over coffee in the morning, quiet discussions while working on particularly challenging repairs, heart-to-heart talks in the evening as they locked up the shop together. Teddy shared stories from his own life that he'd never told anyone, while Luke opened up about the loneliness and uncertainty that had characterized his successful but unfulfilling career. "You know what I miss most," Luke said one evening as they were putting away tools. "The feeling that what I was doing mattered, not to shareholders or market analysts, but to real people with real problems." "Like Mrs. Kowalski and her Civic," Teddy suggested with a smile. Exactly like Mrs. Kowalski and her Civic, that car represented her independence, her ability to get to work and take care of herself. "When we fixed it, we weren't just replacing brake pads, we were protecting her dignity." Teddy nodded, understanding completely. That's the real reward in this work. Not the money or the recognition, but knowing that you've made someone's life a little easier. "I'd forgotten that," Luke admitted. "Somewhere along the way I started measuring success by the wrong metrics." As the weeks passed, Teddy began to see a transformation in Luke that reminded him of the young man's emergence from grief 15 years earlier. The corporate polish gradually gave way to something more authentic, more grounded. Luke started wearing work clothes again, and his hands, soft from years of office work, began to show the calluses that came from honest labor. But more than the external changes, Teddy could see something shifting in Luke's spirit. The restless energy that had characterized him during his first visits was settling into something calmer, more purposeful. He was remembering who he'd been before ambition and expectation had reshaped him. It was during this period that Teddy made a decision that surprised even himself. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and older secrets, the kind of place where important documents gathered dust and life-changing decisions were recorded in careful legal language. Teddy had made the appointment without telling Luke, knowing that certain conversations required the gravity that only official settings could provide. "I want to change my will," Teddy told Beverly Thornton, the attorney who had been handling his modest legal affairs for the past decade. "Of course, Teddy, what modifications did you have in mind?" "I want to leave the shop to Luke Hastings." Beverly looked up sharply from her notepad. She was a careful woman, trained to spot potential complications before they became expensive problems. "The young man who's been working with you recently, he's not family, if that's what you're asking. But he's the closest thing to a son I've got left in this world." "Teddy, I have to ask, are you certain about this? From what I understand, Mr. Hastings has a successful career in Detroit. He may not want to inherit a small-town auto repair shop." Teddy had been wrestling with the same question for weeks. "Maybe not, but I think he needs the choice. The choice to decide what kind of life he wants to build. Right now he's trapped by his own success, doing work that pays well but doesn't feed his soul. The shop would give him an alternative." Beverly made notes on her legal pad, her expression thoughtful. "There are tax implications to consider. The business isn't worth a fortune, but there will be inheritance taxes, and taking over the operation would require significant lifestyle changes on his part." "I know, but I also know that sometimes the most important gifts aren't the ones that make life easier, they're the ones that make life meaningful." The will was drafted and signed that afternoon, with Beverly's secretary and the notary public serving as witnesses. Teddy walked out of the office feeling lighter than he had in months, as if he'd finally found a way to complete a circle that had been left open for too long. He didn't tell Luke about the inheritance immediately. Instead, he began subtly preparing the young man for the possibility of a different future. Their conversations turned increasingly toward the practical aspects of running a small business, customer relations, inventory management, the delicate balance between profit and service that kept independent shops alive. "You ever think about striking out on your own again?" Teddy asked one afternoon, as they worked on a particularly stubborn transmission. Luke paused, his hand still on the wrench. "What do you mean?" "I mean starting your own shop, using all that engineering knowledge you've picked up. Maybe specializing in hybrid and electric vehicle repair. That's where the market's heading, and there aren't many folks around here who know how to work on those systems." "I've thought about it," Luke admitted,
but starting a business from scratch, it would be a huge risk. I'd be walking away from a six-figure salary to chase something that might not work, Teddy agreed. But then again, it might work better than you ever imagined. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one. Luke smiled at that, recognizing the echo of conversations they'd had 15 years earlier. You sound like you're trying to get rid of me again. Not get rid of you, Teddy said carefully. Help you find your way. There's a difference. As Teddy's condition gradually worsened, these conversations took on increased urgency. The cancer was advancing more quickly than the doctors had predicted, and Teddy found himself fighting fatigue that no amount of rest could overcome. But rather than feeling defeated, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if all the loose threads of his life were finally being woven together. The revelation came on a gray morning in mid-December, 3 weeks before Christmas. Teddy had been struggling with a particularly difficult day. The pain medications made him groggy, but without them, the discomfort was too intense to ignore. Luke had taken over most of the actual repair work, while Teddy supervised from a chair that had become a permanent fixture in the main bay. Luke, Teddy said during a quiet moment between customers. There's something I need to tell you. Something in his tone made Luke look up sharply from the engine he was working on. What is it? I've made provisions for the shop. In my will. Luke's face went pale. Mr. Teddy, I don't want to talk about.
We need to talk about it, Teddy interrupted gently, because the decisions I've made affect you directly. Over the next hour, Teddy explained his reasoning, his hopes, and his understanding that Luke might choose a different path. He spoke about the legacy of Declan O'Sullivan, the Irish immigrant, who had given a young black mechanic a chance when no one else would. He talked about the cycle of kindness that had shaped his own life and his desire to see it continue. I'm not trying to trap you, Teddy concluded. If you decide you don't want the responsibility, we can arrange to sell the building and donate the proceeds to charity. But I wanted you to have the option. Luke sat in stunned silence for several minutes, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Why? After all these years, after I disappeared from your life, why would you trust me with something so important? Teddy smiled, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced since Violet's death. Because I know who you are, son. Not the successful engineer in the expensive suit, but the young man who was willing to work himself to death to save his mother. Not the corporate executive worried about quarterly profits, but the boy who cried when Mrs. Kowalski's Civic was running smooth again. But what if I'm not that person anymore? Then you'll become him again. People don't really change, Luke, they just lose sight of themselves sometimes. But the core of who you are, the values your mother instilled and the skills we developed together, that's still there. Luke was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question Teddy had been expecting. What would you want me to do with it? Whatever feels right to you. Keep it the way it is, modernize it, turn it into something completely different. That's your choice to make. The only thing I ask is that you remember what this place represented: honest work, fair prices, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. That evening Luke called his supervisor in Detroit and requested an indefinite leave of absence. The conversation didn't go well. Corporate executives weren't accustomed to valuable employees simply walking away from important projects, but Luke stood firm. I have family obligations, he explained, which was both true and incomplete. For the first time in 15 years, Luke spent Christmas in Cedar Grove. It was a quiet celebration, just the two of them sharing a modest dinner in Teddy's small apartment above the shop, but it felt more meaningful than any of the elaborate holiday parties Luke had attended in Detroit. You know what the best part of this is? Teddy said as they finished their dessert. What's that? I get to see how the story ends. Most folks who pass things down don't get that privilege. Luke reached across the table and grasped Teddy's hand, thinner now, but still strong in the ways that mattered. The story's not ending, Mr. Teddy, it's just starting a new chapter. Theodore Barnes died on a peaceful Sunday morning in late January, slipping away in his sleep as winter snow fell softly outside the windows of Cedar Grove Memorial Hospital. Luke was beside him, having maintained a vigil for the past 3 days as Teddy's condition deteriorated. The funeral was larger than Teddy had expected, filled with customers whose cars he'd kept running, young mechanics he'd mentored over the years, and neighbors who remembered his quiet acts of kindness. Luke delivered the eulogy, speaking about second chances and the ripple effects of generosity that could span generations. Theodore Barnes taught me that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, Luke said, looking out at the faces gathered in the small church. It's measured by what you give away. He gave me a future when I thought I didn't have one, and then he gave me the wisdom to understand that the real reward was in the giving itself. In the weeks that followed, Luke found himself the owner of Teddy's auto repair and the inheritor of responsibilities he wasn't entirely sure he was ready to handle. The legal transfer was straightforward. Beverly Thornton had prepared the documents with her usual thoroughness, but the emotional weight of carrying on Teddy's legacy felt enormous. The shop's regular customers were cautiously optimistic about the transition. They remembered Luke from his teenage years and had watched his recent return with interest, but there was an understandable concern about whether a man who'd spent 15 years in corporate boardrooms could still relate to their practical needs and limited budgets. Luke's first test came when Mrs. Kowalski, now in her 70s but still driving her ancient Civic, brought the car in for what she feared might be a terminal diagnosis. "It's making this awful grinding noise," she explained, her voice heavy with the resignation of someone who couldn't afford bad news. "I know it's old, and I know you probably think I should just buy something newer, but, Mrs. Kowalski," Luke interrupted gently, "this car has been part of my life for almost 20 years. If there's a way to keep it running, we'll find it." The problem turned out to be a worn wheel bearing serious enough to be dangerous if left untreated, but not the expensive engine trouble Mrs. Kowalski had feared. Luke made the repair for the cost of parts plus minimal labor, exactly as Teddy would have done. "You really are Teddy's boy," Mrs. Kowalski said, when she picked up the car, tears in her eyes as she heard her faithful Civic purring smoothly once again. Word of Luke's approach spread quickly through Cedar Grove's tight-knit community. He was fair but not foolish, skilled but not condescending, and he seemed to understand that for many of his customers, their vehicles represented more than transportation, they were symbols of independence and dignity. But Luke also brought innovations that Teddy's traditional approach had never embraced. He invested in diagnostic equipment that could interface with modern computer systems, and he began specializing in hybrid and electric vehicle repair, skills that were increasingly in demand as more environmentally conscious drivers moved to the area. The combination of old-school values and new-world capabilities proved to be exactly what Cedar Grove needed. Luke's appointment book filled quickly, and he found himself working longer hours than he'd ever worked in Detroit. But unlike his corporate job, this work felt meaningful in ways that quarterly reports never had. 6 months after Teddy's death, Luke made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He hired an assistant. Isaiah Jackson was 19 years old, fresh out of high school, and carrying the kind of desperate determination that Luke recognized from his own younger self. Isaiah's family had immigrated from Jamaica when he was 12, and his father's landscaping business was struggling to compete with larger companies that could underbid him on projects. "I'll work for free," Isaiah said when he appeared at the shop one Tuesday morning. "I just need to learn a trade that can't be outsourced or automated." Luke saw himself in the young man's earnest expression and understood that he was being offered the chance to complete a circle that Teddy had started decades earlier. "Nobody works for free," Luke replied. "But if you're serious about learning, I can teach you. The question is whether you're willing to start at the beginning and work your way up." Isaiah's apprenticeship began the next day, and Luke found himself reliving his own early experiences from a different perspective. Teaching someone else forced him to articulate not just the technical aspects of auto repair, but the philosophy behind it, the importance of honesty, the value of taking pride in one's work, and the satisfaction that came from solving problems that mattered to real people. The months passed quickly. Luke's reputation continued to grow, and he found himself turning away customers more often than he would have liked. The success was gratifying, but it also presented him with the same choice that had faced Teddy decades earlier: expand the operation or maintain its intimate personal character. Luke chose expansion, but with careful attention to preserving the shop's essential spirit. He hired a second full-time mechanic, a woman named Gabriela Moreno, who had recently moved to Cedar Grove from Phoenix and brought expertise in electric vehicle systems that complemented Luke's own knowledge. The shop was thriving, but Luke's greatest satisfaction came from watching Isaiah develop into a skilled and confident young man. The parallels to his own experience were sometimes uncanny. Isaiah's initial nervousness, his gradual mastery of complex tasks, his growing understanding that auto repair was as much about people as it was about machines. One evening, as they were closing up after a particularly busy day, Isaiah asked the question that Luke had been expecting. "Luke, why did you come back here? I mean, you had this amazing career in Detroit, you were making serious money, and you gave it all up to run a small-town garage. Why?" Luke paused in his cleaning of a wrench, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated, involving grief and guilt, and the slow recognition that professional success wasn't the same thing as personal fulfillment. But the essence of it was simpler. "Because I remembered what really mattered," he said finally, "and because sometimes you have to go backward to move forward." "But don't you miss it, the prestige, the money, the big city?" Luke smiled, thinking about the question he'd asked himself 1,000 times over the past year. "I miss some of it. I miss feeling like I was on the cutting edge of technology, and I miss the intellectual challenge of working on really complex problems. But I don't miss the feeling that my work didn't matter, that I was just another cog in a machine that valued profit over people." "And you're happy here?" "Happier than I've been in 15 years, Luke replied, without hesitation. "I'm doing work that has meaning, I'm part of a community that matters to me, and I'm carrying on something that was started by someone I loved." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "My dad keeps asking when I'm going to get a real job, something with benefits and a retirement plan and all that. He doesn't understand why I want to spend my life getting my hands dirty." "What do you tell him?" "I tell him this is a real job, one of the realest jobs there is." Luke felt a surge of pride mixed with recognition. This was how legacies were passed down, not through formal ceremonies or legal documents, but through the gradual transmission of values from one generation to the next. "Your dad will understand eventually," Luke said. "When he sees that you've found something you're passionate about, something that uses your talents and serves your community, he'll be proud." "You think so?" "I know so, because that's what parents want for their children, not just success but fulfillment." As they finished their work and prepared to leave, Luke found himself thinking about Teddy and the gift he'd been given. Not just the shop itself, but the opportunity to rediscover who he really was beneath all the layers of ambition and expectation that had accumulated over the years. Teddy had understood something that Luke was only now beginning to fully grasp: the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the chance to build a meaningful life by serving others. 5 years after Teddy's death, the morning sun slanted through the windows of Teddy's Auto Repair, now officially renamed Barnes Hastings Automotive in honor of both the man who had built it and the one who was carrying it forward. Luke stood in the main bay, watching Isaiah work on a hybrid sedan with the confident movements of someone who had found his calling. At 24, Isaiah had grown into an accomplished mechanic with a reputation for solving problems that stumped other shops. More importantly, he had embraced the values that Teddy had passed to Luke, and Luke had passed to him: the commitment to honest work, fair pricing, and treating every customer with dignity. Gabriela Moreno had become a full partner in the business, bringing not only her technical expertise but a business acumen that had helped them expand into commercial fleet maintenance and partnerships with local car dealerships. The shop now employed 6 people full-time and had a waiting list that stretched 2 weeks into the future. But success, Luke had learned, was measured by more than financial metrics or business growth. The real measure was in the stories that played out daily in the bays of the shop, stories of problems solved, independence preserved, and dignity maintained. Like Rosa Navarro, the single mother who cleaned offices at night to support her 3 children. When her ancient minivan had needed a transmission replacement that would have cost more than the vehicle was worth, Luke and his team had found a rebuilt unit and installed it at cost, accepting payment in installments that fit her budget. Or Benjamin Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's grandson, who had returned from military service with injuries that made traditional employment difficult. Luke had hired him part-time to handle customer service and appointment scheduling, giving him a chance to rebuild his confidence along with his civilian career. These weren't isolated acts of charity but the everyday expression of a philosophy that Teddy had embodied and Luke had learned to embrace: that a business could be profitable and compassionate, successful and humane. The bell above the front door chimed, and Luke looked up to see a familiar figure entering the shop. Dr. Ramirez had aged in the 5 years since Teddy's death, his hair now completely gray and his movements showing the careful precision of someone managing arthritis. but his smile was warm as he approached Luke. "Good morning, Dr. Ramirez. What brings you by?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a few minutes?" They walked to the small office at the back of the shop, the same space where Teddy had made his fateful decision to loan Luke the money for his mother's treatment more than 20 years earlier. Dr. Ramirez settled into the visitor's chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints complained about sudden changes in position. "I'm retiring next month," he began. 45 years of practice, and I finally think it's time to let someone younger take over. Congratulations. You've certainly earned it." "Thank you, but that's not actually why I'm here." Dr. Ramirez leaned forward slightly. "There's a young man I'd like you to meet. His name is Dante Freeman, and he's in a situation that, well, it reminds me very much of yours all those years ago." Luke felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of situation?" "He's 18, just graduated from high school. His mother has been fighting lung cancer for the past 2 years, and they've exhausted their savings on treatments. She needs an experimental procedure that insurance won't cover. It costs about $30,000. The number hit Luke like a physical blow. $30,000, twice what Teddy had loaned him, but the same desperate circumstances, the same impossible choice between financial ruin and watching a parent die. Dante has been working part-time at the grocery store, trying to save money, but at minimum wage. Dr. Ramirez shrugged. It would take him years to earn that much, and his mother doesn't have years. "What does this have to do with me?" "I've been watching what you've built here, Luke, not just the business, but the way you've chosen to run it. You've become the kind of person who helps others the way Teddy helped you." Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking about the implications of what Dr. Ramirez was suggesting. $30,000 represented a significant portion of the shop's emergency fund, money that was supposed to protect against equipment failures or economic downturns. "I'd like to meet him," Luke said finally. Dante Freeman arrived at the shop the next afternoon, and Luke felt a shock of recognition that transcended the mere similarity of circumstances. The young black man had the same desperate hope in his eyes that Luke remembered from his own reflection more than 20 years earlier, the same careful posture of someone who was afraid to want something too much. Dante was tall and lean with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and a quiet dignity that reminded Luke of Teddy at that age. His story was heartbreakingly familiar: a mother fighting for her life, medical bills that had consumed everything they owned, and a young man willing to sacrifice everything for the woman who had raised him alone. "I can work," Dante said, echoing Luke's own words from decades earlier. "I can do anything you need, cleaning, organizing, running errands. I'm good with my hands, and I learn fast." Luke found himself studying Dante's face, looking for the same qualities that Teddy must have seen in him, not just desperation, but character. The willingness to work, the determination to protect his family, the pride that made asking for help feel like swallowing glass. "Tell me about your mother," Luke said. Dante's face softened immediately. "She's a teacher, 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. She's been there for 15 years, and she loves those kids like they're her own. Even when she was going through chemo, she'd go to work if she possibly could. She said it gave her something to fight for. And the treatment she needs, it's this new immunotherapy protocol. The doctors say it's shown really promising results in clinical trials, but because it's still experimental, insurance calls it investigational and won't pay for it." Luke nodded, remembering his own conversations with insurance representatives who had perfected the art of saying no with bureaucratic politeness. "What makes you think I'd be willing to help?" Luke asked gently. Dante looked confused. Dr. Ramirez said, "He said you might understand what it's like to be in this situation." "I do understand, but $30,000 is a lot of money. What would you be willing to do to earn it?" "Anything," Dante replied without hesitation. "Anything legal and honest, I'll do it." Luke spent the next hour testing Dante's knowledge and aptitude, much as Teddy had done with him decades earlier. The young man had some basic mechanical knowledge. He'd been maintaining his mother's car since he was 16, but more importantly, he had the intelligence and work ethic that could be developed into real skill. "If I were to consider helping you," Luke said finally, "it wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment in your future, and that would come with obligations." Dante leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of obligations?"
You'd work here part-time while you finish your education, community college, technical school, whatever path makes sense for your goals. After graduation, you'd work here full-time for 3 years while we pay down the loan, and you'd learn this business from the ground up, the same way I did. You mean you'd really do it? You'd loan me the money? Luke felt the weight of the moment, understanding that he was about to step into the role that Teddy had once filled for him. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I mean, I'm going to think about it very seriously. But Dante, you need to understand, this isn't just about the money. If I make this loan, I'm betting on your character, your potential, your willingness to honor your commitments even when it's difficult. I understand, Dante said, his voice thick with emotion, and I promise you won't regret it. That evening, Luke sat in his apartment above the shop, the same space Teddy had once occupied, and wrestled with the decision. $30,000 was a significant risk, and Dante was still largely an unknown quantity. But as Luke thought about the young man's earnest determination and the desperate love in his voice when he spoke about his mother, he found himself remembering Teddy's words from decades earlier. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one. The next morning, Luke called Dante and asked him to come to the shop. When the young man arrived, Luke was waiting with a check and a handshake that changed 2 lives forever.
"Welcome to Barnes Hastings Automotive," Luke said. "Let's get to work." 6 months later, Dante's mother was cancer-free, the immunotherapy having worked even better than the doctors had dared to hope. Mrs. Freeman had returned to her 3rd-grade classroom with renewed energy and a gratitude that expressed itself in homemade cookies that appeared regularly at the shop. Dante had thrown himself into his apprenticeship with the same intensity that Luke remembered from his own early days with Teddy. The young man was a natural teacher himself, helping Isaiah train the shop's newest hire while continuing to develop his own skills with advanced diagnostic equipment. But the most profound change was in Luke himself. Taking on the role of mentor had completed a transformation that had begun with Teddy's death and continued through his return to Cedar Grove. He was no longer the lost corporate executive who had fled from meaningful relationships, nor was he the grieving young man who had once questioned whether life had any purpose at all. He was finally and completely the man that Teddy had always believed he could become. One evening, as Luke was locking up the shop, he found himself standing in the same spot where he'd first met Teddy more than 20 years earlier. The concrete floor still showed oil stains from decades of honest work, and the walls still displayed the same mixture of calendars, photographs, and hand-lettered signs that proclaimed the shop's commitment to quality and integrity. But the space felt different now, not just preserved but truly alive, filled with the energy of young people learning their trade and older ones passing down their wisdom. Teddy's legacy lived on not in the building itself, but in the values that continued to guide every decision, every repair, every interaction with customers who had become part of an extended family. Luke pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in months. Isaiah answered on the second ring. "Hey Luke, everything okay? Everything's fine. I was just thinking about something Teddy used to say." "What's that?" He said, "The best gifts aren't the ones that make life easier, they're the ones that make life meaningful." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "You thinking about Dante, among other things? You know, when Teddy first loaned me that money, I thought it was about saving my mother, and it was partly. But the real gift was what came after, the chance to discover who I really was, what I was capable of becoming. And now you're giving Dante the same chance. We all are, you, me, Gabriella, even Mrs. Kowalski when she brings in cookies and tells Dante stories about his mother's teaching. It's not just about one person helping another, it's about a whole community investing in someone's future." "That's pretty profound for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night." Luke laughed. "Teddy was a profound guy, it just took me a while to understand what he was trying to teach me." After he hung up, Luke walked through the shop one more time, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure for the night. As he reached for the main switch, he paused, remembering another evening decades ago when Teddy had stood in this same spot, making the decision that would change both their lives. The cycle of kindness that had begun with an Irish immigrant named Declan O'Sullivan had passed through Theodore Barnes to Luke Hastings, and now to Dante Freeman and Isaiah Jackson and who knows how many others. Each generation had faced the same choice: to look out only for themselves, or to invest in the possibility that helping others would create something larger and more lasting than individual success. Luke turned off the lights and stepped into the cool night air, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose in equal measure. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the whistle of the late freight train carrying its load toward distant cities, and for the first time in years, he felt no urge to follow it. He was exactly where he belonged. Epilogue. The ripple effect. 10 years later, the dedication ceremony for the Theodore Barnes Memorial Scholarship drew a crowd that overflowed the small auditorium at Cedar Grove Community College. Luke stood at the podium, looking out at faces that told the story of lives touched by kindness passed forward through generations. In the front row sat Mrs. Kowalski, now 81 but still driving her beloved Civic, which Isaiah had converted to run on electric power while preserving its classic appearance. Beside her was Dr. Ramirez, retired but still consulting on difficult cases, and Gabriela Moreno, who had recently been elected to the town council on a platform of sustainable development and community investment. Dante Freeman sat with his mother and his new wife, a teacher he'd met during his final year at the technical college. At 28, Dante had become the shop's lead diagnostic specialist and was already mentoring his own apprentice, a young woman named Amara Williams, whose family had moved to Cedar Grove from Nigeria. Isaiah Jackson had opened his own shop on the other side of town, specializing in classic car restoration, but he still came by Barnes Hastings Automotive regularly to consult on particularly challenging repairs and to maintain the bonds that had shaped his understanding of what work could mean. The scholarship fund had been Luke's idea, established with profits from the shop and donations from customers who wanted to honor Teddy's memory. Each year, it would provide financial assistance to a young person facing the kind of impossible choice that Luke had once faced: someone with potential but no resources, someone whose dreams were being threatened by circumstances beyond their control. Theodore Barnes never went to college, Luke said to the assembled crowd. He learned his trade through apprenticeship, through trial and error, through the generosity of people who saw something in him worth nurturing. This scholarship isn't just about education, it's about opportunity. It's about believing that everyone deserves a chance to discover what they're capable of becoming. As he spoke, Luke's eyes found the faces of the 5 recipients of that year's scholarships: a young single mother studying nursing, a former gang member pursuing automotive engineering, a refugee learning computer programming, an artist developing sustainable business practices, and a veteran studying renewable energy systems. Each of them carried their own version of the desperation and hope that Luke remembered from his own youth. Each of them represented a chance for the community to invest in possibilities rather than simply managing problems. Teddy used to say that kindness was the most practical investment you could make, Luke continued. Not because it guaranteed returns, but because it created the kind of world where everyone had a chance to contribute their gifts. Today we're not just honoring his memory, we're committing to continue the work he started. After the ceremony, Luke found himself standing outside the community college with Dante, watching the scholarship recipients talk with their families and begin to imagine futures that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "You know what strikes me most about this," Dante said. "What's that?" "None of these kids know about Teddy directly. They never met him, never heard his voice, never shook his hand, but his kindness is still changing their lives." Luke nodded, thinking about the invisible threads that connected Declan O'Sullivan to Theodore Barnes, to himself and Dante and Isaiah, and all the others whose lives had been touched by the simple decision to help someone in need. "That's how it works," he said. "Kindness doesn't die with the person who shows it, it just finds new hands to carry it forward." As they walked toward their cars, Dante asked the question that had been on his mind all evening: "Do you think we're doing enough? I mean, there are so many people who need help, and we can only do so much." "You remember what Teddy told me once," Luke replied. "He said we're not responsible for solving every problem in the world, we're just responsible for doing what we can with what we have, where we are. And if everybody did that, then the world would be the kind of place where young people don't have to choose between saving their parents and pursuing their dreams, where hard work and good character are enough to build a meaningful life, where kindness isn't the exception, but the rule."
They reached their cars and prepared to part ways, but Dante paused with his hand on the door handle. "Luke, thanks for everything." "Thank Teddy," Luke replied. "I'm just passing along what he gave me." "No," Dante said firmly. "Teddy gave you the opportunity. Everything you did with it, building the business, creating jobs, establishing the scholarship, investing in people like me, that was your choice. Teddy planted the seed, but you grew the tree." Luke felt a warmth spread through his chest, the satisfaction of understanding that his life had mattered in ways that extended far beyond his own happiness or success. As he drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, Luke found himself thinking about the young man he'd been when he first walked into Teddy's shop, desperate, frightened, carrying burdens too heavy for his age. That boy couldn't have imagined the life that was waiting for him, the community he would help build, the legacy he would carry forward, but perhaps that was the point. The most important gifts were often the ones we couldn't imagine receiving, just as the most meaningful contributions were often the ones we never planned to make. Luke pulled into the parking lot behind his shop and sat for a moment in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the whistle of a freight train, carrying its cargo toward destinations unknown. But unlike the young man who had once dreamed of escape, Luke felt no urge to follow. He was home, in every sense that mattered. And tomorrow there would be more cars to fix, more problems to solve, more opportunities to demonstrate that kindness was not just a luxury for the wealthy or a fantasy for the naive, but the most practical force in the world for creating the kind of life worth living. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would, carried forward by people who understood that the greatest success was not in what you accumulated for yourself, but in what you made possible for others. Theodore Barnes would have been proud.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.